I learned exactly how much confidence a man can pour into wet concrete on a Tuesday morning in July of 1998. It takes 2 mixer trucks, a foreman with a clipboard, a brand new red pickup with chrome wheels, and one neighbor who has spent so long being told yes that he starts to believe the dirt under everybody else's boots belongs to him too. By the time the second truck backed past my old pear tree, I was standing in my kitchen outside Muncie, Indiana, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand, watching my neighbor build the first wall of a garage 11 feet inside my pasture. My name is Marty Ellis. I was 56 that summer, and I had spent most of my life working maintenance at the Delco plant, the kind of job that teaches you 2 things early. Machines do not care how confident you are, and neither do measurements. I lived on 4 acres at the end of Hickory Run Road, in a cedar-sided house my father built with his own hands in 1961, back when the road was mostly gravel and every mailbox along it leaned a little to the left. Behind my house was a narrow pasture that sloped toward a shallow drainage creek. Nothing fancy, just tall grass, 2 old pear trees, a patch of black walnuts, and a rusted iron pipe buried near the fence line that had marked the corner of our property for longer than I had been alive. My dad used to say that pipe had more honesty in it than half the people who ever shook his hand. I never really understood what he meant until I met Nolan Briggs. Nolan moved in next door the previous fall with his wife Diane and a little girl named Abby who liked to ride her bike in circles at the bottom of their driveway. At first I tried to like him. He was 42, clean-shaven, sharp-dressed, always in a hurry, always talking into one of those big Motorola flip phones like he was negotiating the end of the Cold War. He owned 3 appliance stores around town, sold refrigerators, washers, dishwashers, the kind of things people bought when they wanted their neighbors to think life was going well. He bought the old Keller place next to mine, tore out the yellow kitchen, painted the outside a deep gray, replaced the porch lights with brass fixtures, and told anybody who would listen that he was bringing the property into the modern age. The trouble started with little things, which is how trouble usually starts when people live too close together. Nolan complained that leaves from my pear trees blew into his yard. Then he asked if I would trim the lower branches because they ruined the view from his upstairs office. Then one afternoon I came home and found a bundle of survey flags stuck in the grass near the back of my pasture, about 10 feet beyond where they had any business being. I walked over, pulled one out, and followed the string line until it ended beside Nolan's new shed. That was when he came strolling out in loafers, holding a can of Diet Coke, looking pleased with himself. He said, "Just planning ahead, Marty. I want to put up a little workshop back here, something tasteful." I asked him where he got his line. He said the real estate agent told him the boundary ran near the drainage ditch. I told him the ditch had never been the boundary, not in my father's day, not in my day, and not in any deed I had ever seen. He smiled the way some men smile when they think they are speaking to someone too old to argue. "Come on," he said, "that strip is nothing but weeds. You are not using it." I remember looking at him for a moment, trying to decide whether he was rude or just stupid. Then I said, "Nolan, land does not stop being yours because somebody else decides it looks empty." He gave a short laugh, shook his head, and said, "You old-timer types get sentimental over dirt." Maybe I did, maybe I still do. My wife, Linda, had been gone almost 8 years by then, and that pasture was where she used to sit in a lawn chair every fall with a blanket over her knees, watching our daughter Claire teach her little boy how to throw a baseball. It was where my father kept his vegetable garden before his knees got bad. It was where I had buried our old beagle under the walnut tree after he finally gave out at 15. So yes, I was sentimental about that dirt, but I was not confused about who owned it. I told Nolan I would look into the records, and he said, "Do whatever makes you feel better." That should have been the end of it, but a few months passed. Winter came and went, and then one humid July morning I heard the sound of bulldozers. At first I thought the county was working on the road, but when I looked through the kitchen window I saw a crew tearing down the old split-rail fence along the edge of my pasture. They had pushed aside a section of grass, flattened a strip of ground, and marked out a rectangle with stakes. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Rick Sutter, was standing beside a set of plans clipped to a board. I put on my boots, walked across the yard, and asked what they were building. Rick said, 36 by 60 steel garage, 2 bays, office loft, car lift, the works. Your neighbor says he's opening a little restoration business out here. I looked at the stakes, then looked at the plans. The western wall of that garage was sitting where my pasture began. I said, "Rick, you may want to check that line again." He looked uncomfortable right away, and I could tell he'd already noticed something did not add up. He said, "Mr. Briggs gave us a copy of a plat. I go where the owner tells me." I nodded and said, "I understand. I am not blaming you, but this section belongs to me." Before Rick could answer, Nolan came out of his house in a white polo shirt and sunglasses, acting like he had been waiting for an audience. He said, "Marty, we already talked about this. The line is at the ditch." I pointed toward the rusted iron pipe near the pear tree. "No, that pipe is the corner." He walked over, looked down at it, and kicked it with the toe of his shoe. "That old thing could be anything," I said. "It is an iron pin. It has been there since before you were born." Nolan looked at the crew, then back at me and said, "Marty, I have a contractor, I have a schedule, and I have money tied up in this. I'm not stopping because of a rusty piece of metal in the grass. I wish I could tell you I had some clever answer ready, something sharp enough to make him regret saying it, but I did not. I just stood there and watched the first concrete truck roll through the gap in my fence. Maybe that sounds weak. Maybe it was. But I had lived long enough to know there is a difference between something you know in your gut and something you can prove when the other man hires a lawyer. So I went back inside, opened the green metal filing cabinet in my utility room, and pulled out every paper my father had ever saved. Old tax receipts, faded maps, warranty deeds, a folder full of handwritten notes, and finally a yellowed survey from 1963 with coffee stains along one edge. The line was there, faint but clear. My father's property ran straight from the iron pipe near the pear tree to a stone marker at the creek, and Nolan's garage was going to sit right across it. That afternoon I drove into town and parked behind the Delaware County Recorder's office, where the air smelled like dust, old paper, and floor wax. The clerk behind the desk was a woman named Lena Kroll, who had worked there so long she probably remembered where my father filed the original deed. I showed her the survey, and she disappeared into the records room. 20 minutes later, she came back with a thick folder, a microfiche printout, and a look on her face that told me I was not imagining things. She said, "Mr. Ellis, your father recorded this boundary in 1964. There is a supplemental survey from 1971, too. The line did not move." I asked whether Nolan had filed anything. She checked, then shook her head. No boundary adjustment, no easement, no land purchase, no lendment, no leasement, no land purchase, no permit for a new structure, nothing. I remember feeling strangely calm after that. Angry, sure, but calm. When a man has spent enough years fixing broken pumps, failed motors, and factory equipment that somebody swore was fine yesterday, he learns to appreciate the moment when the problem finally shows itself. I called Earl Sutton, an old surveyor who had measured half the farms in the county before most of the new subdivisions existed. Earl was 71, wore a canvas hat year-round, and drove a tan Ford truck that looked older than some of the roads he used. He came out 2 days later carrying a transit, a steel tape, and the same kind of patience doctors use when they already know the diagnosis but want you to hear it gently. He found the iron pipe, then the stone marker by the creek, then a second buried pin near the back corner of Nolan's lot. After an hour of measuring, he looked at the concrete forms and let out a low whistle. "Marty," he said, "he is not a couple feet over." I asked how bad it was. Earl pointed with his tape. 11 feet at the west wall, 14 feet where he widened the apron. And that driveway he is grading, it crosses your pasture almost all the way to the garage doors. I looked across the grass at the wet concrete, the stacks of steel framing, the workers carrying lumber, and for a minute I felt something in my chest settle into a place that was colder than anger. I asked Earl what he would do. He looked at me over his glasses and said, "I am a surveyor, Marty. I measure where people stand. What they do after that is between them, their conscience and the courthouse." I paid him for a certified survey, took pictures with my old Minolta camera, and sent Nolan a registered letter the next morning. I kept it simple. The survey showed the garage and driveway were on my property. He needed to stop work immediately. He needed to remove the forms, restore the pasture, and contact me through an attorney if he wanted to discuss anything further. I even sent a copy to the contractor, because I had no desire to see Rick Sutter lose money over a problem Nolan had created. Nolan signed for the letter at 11:15 that morning. At 1:30 he walked across my yard without knocking and tossed the envelope onto my porch. He said, "You really want to turn this into a neighborhood war over a strip of grass? I told him it stopped being a strip of grass when he poured concrete on it. He said, "I will buy it from you. $5,000. That is more than it is worth." I said, "It is not for sale." He laughed and said, "Everything is for sale, Marty. You just have not heard the right number." Then he pointed toward the garage and said, "I have already put 20,000 into that building. You are not going to make me tear it down because you are feeling sentimental." I said, "You are not hearing me. This is not about sentiment. This is about you deciding you could take something before asking for it." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne and the cigarette smoke clinging to his shirt. "You know what your problem is?" he said. "You think quiet makes you wise. Most of the time it just makes people walk around you." I watched him walk back to his house, and I will be honest, I wanted to follow him. I wanted to yell. I wanted to stand in front of the concrete truck and make a scene big enough for every porch on Hickory Run Road. But I did not. I had written proof. I had photographs. I had a survey. And I knew one more thing. Nolan did not think I would do anything because men like him always mistake restraint for surrender. The crew kept working, not because I stayed silent, but because Nolan told Rick to keep going. Rick came over once and apologized. He said he had told Nolan the survey might be a problem, but Nolan said it was old man drama and promised he would handle it. I told Rick not to worry about me. I said, "You are doing a job. He is the one making choices." Over the next 3 weeks, the garage rose out of my pasture like a metal monument to bad judgment. It had red steel siding, white trim, 2 roll-up doors, and a second-floor office with windows facing my house. Nolan installed a hydraulic lift, fluorescent lights, a big black sign over the entrance that read Briggs Motorworks, and a paved apron wide enough for trucks to pull in and turn around. He started parking his 1968 Camaro inside, then a restored Mustang he had bought at auction, then a motorcycle with more chrome on it than my kitchen sink. Every evening he would stand in the open doorway with a beer in his hand, looking out over the property like he had built a kingdom. One Friday afternoon he called across the yard, "Hey Marty, you should come by next weekend. I am having an open house. Car club, some business people, catering, the whole deal." I looked at the garage, at the part of it sitting squarely on my ground, and said, "That sounds like a big day." He grinned. "It is. I am finally building something that matters." I said, "That is usually when people ought to make sure they are standing in the right place." He did not understand what I meant, not then. Part 2. The week before Nolan's open house, I barely slept. Not because I doubted the survey, and not because I was afraid of him. I slept badly because I kept hearing my father's voice, the way he used to talk when he was fixing a fence after somebody's cattle got loose. He would say, "Do not let another man's carelessness turn you careless too." I did not want to become the kind of person who enjoyed ruining somebody else's day. But I also knew that if I let Nolan use that driveway, let him invite people across it, let him act like it belonged to him long enough, the mess would only get worse. It would become a cloud on my title. It would become an argument at some future sale. It would become one more thing my daughter would have to untangle after I was gone. So I called Earl again and asked him to come place permanent boundary stakes before the weekend. He arrived Thursday morning with orange caps, white flagging tape, and a manila envelope full of diagrams. He set the first stake at the iron pipe, another near the pear tree, a third beside the driveway, then stretched a line all the way toward the creek. The line cut right through Nolan's wide blacktop apron and clipped the edge of the garage wall. It was so clear that even I felt a little sick looking at it. I stood there with Earl while he packed up his equipment. He said, "You going to put a fence up?" I said, "I do not know yet." He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You know what people forget about fences? They're not there because neighbors hate each other. They are there so good neighbors can stay good neighbors." That night, around 10, I heard an engine outside. I looked through the living room curtains and saw Nolan's pickup parked near the garage. He was walking along the survey line with a flashlight. I watched him pull up the stake near the driveway, then the one by the pear tree. He did not know I was watching. The next morning the flags were gone. The survey pins were still there, buried in the dirt, but the visible markers had disappeared. I walked over to Nolan's house and knocked on his door. He opened it in a t-shirt and jeans, looking annoyed before I even said a word. I asked, "Did you remove the survey flags?" He said, "They were ugly." I said, "They marked my boundary." He shrugged. They marked an opinion. I could feel my hands tightening at my sides. I said, "No, Nolan, they marked a recorded boundary. There is a difference." He smiled again, but this time it was thinner. "You want to make a spectacle out of this? Go ahead. I have people coming Saturday. I am not tearing down a building because you found a piece of paper in a filing cabinet." I said, "You keep talking like this is happening to you. It is happening because of you." He shut the door without answering. Later that afternoon, I drove to the sheriff's office and spoke with Deputy Randall Pierce, a man I had known since high school. Randy was not a lawyer and did not pretend to be one. He looked at the survey, the photos, the registered letter, and the copy of the county records. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "Marcy, this is a civil dispute, but you have every right to protect your property. Just do not touch his building, do not block a public road, and do not give him an excuse to say you damaged anything." I asked him what he would do. He gave me the kind of tired half smile people in law enforcement get when they have seen too many neighbor fights turn ugly. I would make the boundary impossible to miss. That was all I needed to hear. Behind my barn, under an old blue tarp, I still had the 14-foot farm gate my father used to keep livestock out of the lower field. It was heavy galvanized steel, with square wire mesh across the middle and a hinge that groaned like an old screen door. I had not used it in years. On Saturday morning, while Nolan was inside polishing the Camaro and setting up folding tables for his party, I dug 2 post holes on my side of the survey line. It was slow work, the ground hard from the summer heat, but I did not rush. I set the first post beside the pear tree, the second at the edge of the paved apron, and by noon the gate stood directly across the section of my pasture Nolan had turned into his driveway. I put a small white sign on it that said "Private Property, No Vehicle Access," and I ran a clean new chain through the latch and locked it with a brass padlock. It was not pretty, it was not subtle, but it was honest. I had just finished tightening the last bolt when Nolan walked outside carrying a box of plastic cups. He stopped so fast that a few cups rolled down the driveway. For a second he did not say anything. Then he looked at the gate, looked at the sign, looked at me and said, "You have got to be kidding me." I wiped my hands on my jeans and said, "No." He walked toward me fast. "You put a gate across my driveway." I said, "I put a gate across my pasture." He pointed at the garage. "My guests need to get in there." I said, "Then you should have built an entrance on your land." His face went red. "Move it." I shook my head. "No." He stepped close enough that I could see a bead of sweat near his temple. "Marty, I have 40 people coming. I have a caterer. I have buyers coming from Indianapolis. You cannot embarrass me like this." I looked past him at the polished cars, the banners, the folding tables covered in white cloth, and the big black sign he had hung over the garage doors. Then I said, "You embarrassed yourself when you decided my land was yours." He pulled out his flip phone and said, "I'm calling the sheriff." I said, "That is probably a good idea." The first guest arrived about 20 minutes later in a cherry red 1957 Chevy Bel Air. He rolled down the driveway, saw the gate, and stopped with the engine rumbling softly. Behind him came a dark blue Corvette, then a pickup pulling a trailer with an old Pontiac GTO on it. Within half an hour, Nolan's driveway looked like a car show stuck at a railroad crossing. The people got out, stared at the gate, stared at the garage, and started asking questions. Nolan tried to smile. He told one group it was a temporary safety measure. He told another group there had been a mix-up with the county. Then somebody asked why the gate was locked, and I heard him say, "Because my neighbor is being difficult." That was when I walked across my yard holding the certified survey in a clear plastic folder. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I stood on my side of the gate and said, "Folks, there is no safety problem. There is no county emergency. This gate is on my property because the driveway behind it is on my property. Mr. Briggs was told that weeks ago." The silence that followed was the kind you can feel in your teeth. A man in a leather vest looked down at the survey, then looked at the concrete apron, then said, "Nolan, you built the driveway on his land?" Nolan snapped, "It is not that simple." The man said, "Looks pretty simple from where I am standing." Diane came out of the house then, holding Abby's hand. And I could see the panic in her face. She was not like Nolan. She had always been polite to me, always waved when she drove by, and in that moment I felt bad for her. She asked quietly, "Marty, is there any way we can just talk about this inside?" I said, "I tried to talk. I sent him a survey. I sent him a letter. He removed the stakes. She looked at Nolan, and whatever she saw in his face told her I was not lying. A few minutes later, Deputy Pierce pulled up in his cruiser. Nolan hurried over to him, talking fast, waving his arms toward the gate, saying I had blocked access to his building and ruined his event. Randy listened without interrupting, then asked to see the documents. I handed him the survey, the records, the registered letter, and the photos. He walked the boundary with Earl's map in one hand and his notepad in the other. When he came back, Nolan was waiting like a man waiting for a referee to overturn a bad call. Randy said, "Mr. Briggs, I am not deciding ownership here today. That is for a court if it comes to it. But Mr. Barrex, Ellis has documented survey markers, recorded deeds, and written notice. You do not have permission to use that portion of his land. Do not cut the lock, do not move the gate, and do not cross it without his consent." Nolan stared at him. "So you are just going to let him shut down my business?" Randy said. "No, sir. I am telling you not to trespass. The rest is between you and your lawyer." Nolan's party did not end all at once. It came apart in pieces. A couple of men stayed in the front yard and drank beer from paper cups. A few guests walked around the side of the house and left quietly. The caterer packed up the trays of pulled pork and corn casserole before sunset. The car club members who had come to admire Nolan's shop spent most of the afternoon standing near the gate, talking low, looking back and forth between him and me. The thing about humiliation is it does not need a speech. Sometimes all it needs is a locked gate, a bad decision, and enough witnesses. Around 7 that evening, I saw Nolan standing alone in front of the garage. The fluorescent lights were on inside, bright and cold against the darkening sky. His Camaro sat on the lift. His tables were half cleared, and the sign over the door looked foolish now, too large for the building beneath it. He looked toward my house, and for one brief second I thought he might walk over and apologize. Instead, he turned away and went inside. Part 3. Monday morning, I called the county planning office again. This time I spoke to Carmen Ruiz, the building inspector, a woman in her late 40s who had the steady voice of somebody who had heard every excuse a homeowner could invent. I told her the structure was complete, that it had been built without a permit, that part of the driveway and building crossed a recorded property line, and that I had photographs of the work from the first day. She came out that afternoon in a white county SUV with a clipboard, a hard hat, and a stack of forms. Nolan was home. He came outside before she reached the garage and started talking before she introduced herself. "This is a private dispute," he said. "My neighbor is trying to extort me." Carmen looked at him, then at the building, then at the survey I handed her. She asked whether he had a permit for the steel structure. He said he had submitted paperwork. She asked for the permit number. He could not give her one. She walked around the garage, looked at the electrical panel, checked the footings that were still visible along one side, and asked why the driveway grade had been changed without drainage approval. Nolan kept saying he would get everything handled. Carmen finally said, "Mr. Mudd, Briggs, you cannot build first and ask permission later, especially when the structure crosses a surveyed line and the access route is disputed. This building is not approved for occupancy, and the work stops today." Then she taped a bright red stop work order to one of the roll-up doors. It was not a movie moment. There was no dramatic music, no crowd, no shouting, just a red piece of paper flapping against fresh steel siding in the hot Indiana wind. But I could see it land on Nolan, harder than any punch I could have thrown. For the next 2 weeks, he tried everything. First, he offered me $10,000 for the strip of land. Then 15, then 25. He told me it was stupid to hold up a business over a narrow corner of pasture. He said I would never even notice it was gone. I told him the same thing every time. It is not for sale. Then his lawyer called. A young man from Indianapolis with a polished voice and a fax machine number at the bottom of every page. He said I had allowed the construction to proceed. I told him I had warned Nolan before the concrete was poured, sent a registered letter after the survey, notified the contractor, photographed the work, and documented the removal of boundary stakes. There was a long pause on the line. Then he asked whether I would consider mediation. I said I would consider it after Nolan admitted the building was on my land. We never got that far. One evening Diane came over by herself. It was raining softly, the kind of summer rain that makes the whole yard smell like wet grass and warm pavement. She stood under my porch light with her arms folded tight across her chest. She looked tired, older than she had a month before. She said, "I know he was wrong." I did not say anything. She looked down at the porch boards and continued. He grew up with nothing, Marty. His father used to tell him he would never own more than a trailer and a rusty truck. This garage was supposed to be proof that he made something of himself. I understood more than she probably expected me to. I knew what it was like to want your father to be proud. I knew what it felt like to build your life one paycheck at a time and still feel like you were behind everybody else. But I also knew that pain does not give a person the right to take from another person. So I said, Diane, I am sorry he is hurting. I am sorry you were caught in it. But he did not lose that building because he came from nothing. He lost it because he thought he could skip the part where he asks. She nodded slowly, and tears filled her eyes, but she did not argue. About a week later, Nolan came over just before dusk. He was wearing an old grey sweatshirt, no cologne, no sunglasses, no phone in his hand. He looked like he had not slept in days. He stood at the edge of my driveway for a moment before speaking. The county gave me 30 days, he said. I nodded. I knowed. He looked toward the garage. The steel company says they can take it apart and move what they can. The concrete has to be broken up. The driveway has to be removed from your side. I am going to lose almost $70,000 by the time it is over. There was no anger in his voice then, just exhaustion. I said, that is a lot of money. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You happy? It would have been easy to say yes. I had imagined that moment more than once, him standing there with all that certainty gone from his face. But when it came, I did not feel happy. I felt sad in a way, sad that a man could have avoided so much damage by listening for 5 minutes. I looked at the pear tree, at the grass beyond it, at the steel garage sitting crooked against the line, and I said, Nolan, I do not want your money. I do not want your money. I do not want you embarrassed. I wanted you to stop before it got this far. He looked at me then, really looked at me and said, I thought you were too quiet to fight. I said, you mistook quiet for tired. The demolition started on a Thursday morning in late August. The same way the project began, it arrived with trucks, workers, noise, and men carrying tools. But this time, they were taking things apart instead of putting them together. They removed the roll-up doors, unbolted the red steel panels, cut the framing loose, and hauled the lift away on a flatbed trailer. Then came the jackhammers. For 3 days, the sound of concrete breaking echoed down Hickory Run Road. The blacktop apron was cut along the survey line and torn out of my pasture. The soil beneath it was compacted and ugly, but after the crew left, I spent a weekend turning it over with an old tiller and spreading grass seed by hand. Earl came by once to check the markers. He stood beside the restored line, hands in his pockets, and said, well, your fence is not really a fence anymore. I looked at the old farm gate leaning against my barn and said, no, it did its job. Nolan did not move away right away. That part surprised me. For a while, he kept to himself. The cars disappeared from the driveway one by one. The big sign over the garage doors came down. A smaller legal workshop eventually went up on his own side of the boundary. Nothing flashy, just a simple building with one bay and a gravel drive that never touched my grass. We did not become friends. Some stories do not end that neatly, but after that, Nolan waved when he saw me outside. Not every time, but most times. And when Abby rode her bike too close to the pear trees, he would call out gently, "Stay on our side, sweetheart." The first time I heard him say it, I almost laughed. A year later, my daughter Claire came over with my grandson, and we sat in the backyard while he threw a baseball near the walnut tree. He asked why there was an old metal gate leaning behind the barn. I told him it was there because sometimes people need to see a line before they understand one. He nodded like children do when they know you are saying something important, but do not yet know what it means. Maybe one day he will. Maybe all of us do eventually. So tell me, what would you have done? Would you have stopped the first concrete truck and made a scene before the walls went up? Would you have accepted the money and sold the strip of land? Or would you have done what I did? Put up the gate, let the truth stand in plain sight, and make the man who ignored the boundary explain himself in front of everybody? Leave your answer in the comments, because I still wonder sometimes whether I was protecting what was mine, or whether I waited just long enough to make sure he learned the lesson the hard way. And if you know somebody who mistakes quiet for permission, share this story with them. Some lines are painted, some are fenced, and some are buried in the ground where only honest people bother to look.